LabCom was created, that all this synergistic activity is happening, and so I'm happy to participate with you all in that today. And so I'm going to share with you our research on notions of the narrative self. And so and the importance of narrative and language in constructing the social interaction between people and between people and robots. And with the idea that we're motivated by this notion of neurorobotics, and looking at how human physiological systems can achieve cognition. Let's just get right into it. So we often consider that language can express meaning, but language actually also creates meaning. And so there's a huge literature led by Jerome Bruner, who wrote a famous book called Acts of Meaning, where he explains that in narrating situations, we add information, we enrich what has been seen physically, and create meaning. And so even when you're telling stories about what you did today, what you did on vacation, you're adding emotive and social and causal information to the physical events that occurred and creating meaning. And so we're interested in this enriching of meaning and how narrative enrichment can work and how that can come to aid robots in interaction with people. And so what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit the build-up that takes us to the level of narrative. And so finally, narrative is a way that we can communicate and understand experience. And so we're going to talk about how do we understand. And finally, and this is sort of a deep philosophical question, what does it mean to understand things? So understanding, what we've shown from neuroscience studies, is based on fitting what it is we're trying to understand with our own self-experience. So when you see this picture, part of the way you understand that is by your own experience of raking leaves in a garden. And if you've never raked leaves in a garden, you've probably at least swept things in a kitchen. So you have some experience with this kind of activity, and so you understand by projecting into your own experience. And if you can't in some way project into your own experience, then you can't understand. So this kind of understanding can occur at multiple scales of time and complexity. So it can happen at the level of the word, and we'll talk about mapping the word to embodied meaning. Then it can also happen at the sentence level, and then finally it can happen at the narrative level, where you're actually telling stories about after the girl raked the leaves, she went inside and had a hot chocolate with her parents, something like this. So our goal is to build computational neuroscience models that can build what we're going to call an embodied cognitive system for understanding, based on human brain dynamics and allowing us to understand human brain dynamics, and then crucially embedding these models into humanoid robots that allow these robots to interact with people. And so we're just going to start going through this slide. So how do we understand words? So how do we map words to embodied meaning? So when you hear the word raking, or I forget how to say the word raking in French, but that evokes in you this sensation of raking leaves. So in order to address this question, we did experiments with brain imaging using fMRI, where you can observe the activity in the brain of human subjects while they're doing different tasks. We asked people to either look at pictures like that picture that you saw of the girl raking the leaves, or to read sentences that describe these same kind of things. The girl raked the leaves in the garden. And then we observed brain activity that is active in common in both of these kind of situations. And so the goal there was to try to understand, how does the brain represent meaning of physical actions performed by humans, independent of whether that came from a visual scene or a sentence. And so what we found was quite interesting, as you might expect if you know about mirror neurons and the sensory motor activation of meaning. We saw activation of the motor system, so in the premotor cortex, But we also saw activation in areas that are involved in representation of the self in space, that are involved in emotion processing, that are involved in planning processing in the prefrontal cortex, and then these kind of common areas that are known from other neuroscience studies to be convergence zones where multiple representations project together. And so what this means is understanding these kind of sentences or pictures, it's not just a sensory motor understanding. You're really projecting that into your own experience and how you feel about these things and what was happening then. So meaning is really related to your own personal experience and fusing things together. So we said this can help us to try to build a robotic system that can have this kind of neural representation of meaning. And so using the iCub with Stefan Lalle as part of his PhD program, we have in the iCub, as you know, and related to any kind of a robotic system, you have sensors all over the place. So we have vision sensors, we have proprioceptive joint angle sensors. So we have information about where the head is, where the eyes are, where the arms are. And so we can ask, is it possible to give the robot this kind of embodied sensation of meaning? So we have it perform a simple task where it hears the words rock, scissors, and paper. And when it hears these words, it's also been programmed to produce these postures. So when that happens, we get proprioceptive values from the arm position and the hand position. We get proprioceptive values of the head position. We get a visual signal from the cameras of the robot, and then we have this speech signal coming in. So, and then we can, so these are Cahonen-style self-organizing maps that are representing the coherence of these signals arriving. And then we have what we call a multimodal convergence map that gets inputs from these different sensory domains and associates them together. And the idea is that with this associative memory, we can go in both directions. So, for example, as the system is learning, the arm proprioception, head proprioception, the visual signal from the cameras, and the speech signal are all associated together. That's convergence. And then by divergence, if we later give only the speech signal, so we say scissors, and that will then activate this map, which will activate the associative memory. And then by divergence, the associative representation will reactivate the visual signal, producing a mental image of the scissors configuration. And if we turn the robot into the motor activation mode, it will also activate joint angle commands that push the robot to these configurations of making this movement. So in fact, then we can say, what does the word scissors mean for this robot? What it means is the mental image that was learned when it was doing the scissors configuration, the physical sensation, and the physical action of producing this posture. So we've got kind of a first step towards some notion of grounded sensory motor meaning here. And so we can start to construct a cognitive architecture, if you want, with the human saying things like rock, scissors, paper, joint angles, camera, image, and speech signal going into this map. So this is the beginning of our embodied cognitive system. Now we can ask, how do we map sentences to events? So we're going beyond the single word and starting to talk about sentences. And so you can look at this question in terms of how do you go from a sentence to some kind of a predicate argument representation of meaning. So in this simple example, I'm just showing you that there are two strings of words that both communicate the same idea that the dog is the agent, the elephant is the object, and the monkey is the recipient. But the word order is different. So we can't just take some simple pattern and say the first word, the first open class word is the agent, the second is the object, the third is the recipient, because we see that doesn't work here. So we have to try to build a system that can decode these sentences correctly. And so the little hint, the astuce, is that these different surface forms map to the same meaning, and that mapping is indicated by these grammatical function words like was and to and by. So somehow we want to use these grammatical words in order to represent the mapping of these different sentences to their respective meanings. And so over the years, we've built different systems, neural network models, that basically say, okay, I'm going to take as input the sequence of words in the sentence, and I'm going to create a dynamic spatiotemporal pattern in a recurrent neural network based on that sequence of inputs. And we recall here that for these two sentences, the sequence of inputs will be different. So there's two different input patterns that can be associated with two different mappings of these open class words onto the predicate, agent, object, or recipient value in the meaning. And so basically, in resume, without going into detail, these systems take as input, word by word, the sentences, and then as output, they give what we call a semantic analysis in terms of, okay, for the open class words John, hit, and Mary, John is the object, hit is the predicate, and Mary is the agent. And for a different sentence, there'll be a different mapping. So it can basically learn this sentence to meaning mapping problem. And we've spent some time illustrating that this model, it's not only interesting from a theoretical point of view, it's also interesting from a practical point of view, because the neural activity inside this neural network can be used to understand human brain potentials when people are doing exactly this kind of task, understanding these kind of sentences. And then also a criticism of such a model is, well, can it generalize to new grammatical forms? And so in the 15, 20 years ago when we first started this work, limited by computing resources, we didn't have enough training power to be able to demonstrate generalization. But more recently, using modern computing, machine learning, and large corpora, we've demonstrated that indeed, when it's trained on sufficient sentence meaning input corpora, the system can then generalize to new grammatical structures that it's never seen before. So so now we've gone from the word now to the sentence, and so we can embed this neural network for sentence comprehension. We can now embed that along with a system that will just go in the opposite direction, taking meaning as an input and producing the sentence as the output. We can now embed that into our cognitive system. So sentences are coming in here, being understood by the comprehension model, producing action representations that can be used then to control the robot. So now we're building up this embodied cognitive system. And so I'll show you an example here where what you're going to see is activation of both the sentence comprehension, where Anne-Laure is going to tell the robot to do things, and then she's going to ask questions, and based on the meaning representation, the robot will produce sentences answering these questions. Understood the before-after relation. Now those actions are sent to the motor system. And now the robot knows what it's done, and it can answer questions. Oh, okay, maybe did I... So, in the rest of this video, Anne-Laure can ask questions like, what happened first? What did you do? And the robot can look in its memory of what's just happened and use the sentence production system to describe these same actions. So now we've got this sensory motor representation of words. We've got sentences, and now we want to go beyond the sentence. And in fact, in our research, we spent some time wondering about what is it that people talk about. When you're talking, what do you use language for? Sometimes you use language to ask for a simple command, give me the object, put this thing on the left. But more often, a sentence is embedded in a group of sentences that tells a story, and tells a story about why did we do something. And so this is this notion of narrative. And so, as an example, imagine that parents take a child to the zoo, and the child, he's never been to the zoo before, maybe 2 years old, and he sees things happening, like a man putting food in the tray for the elephant. So he sees these things happening, understands a little bit, but then he goes home. And so this experience, what we can say is it will create a skeleton situation model. The situation model is a representation of what happened. So the actions that the child sees are recorded, but they're not really linked together yet. Then the parent can say things like, oh, the man gave the elephant food because he knew the elephant was hungry. The elephant hadn't eaten since yesterday. So this is hidden information that was not visible in what the child saw, but the parent somehow knew about this and could add this information to the child's experience. So the idea is that then adult narrative enriches and structures the situation model, and this is where meaning it comes in. This is where causal relations, like he fed the child he fed the elephant because it was hungry. This new meaning is injected into the representation, and then the next time when the child observes this kind of thing, he sees somebody feeding a different kind of animal, he can remember, oh yeah, he must be feeding because he knows the animal is hungry. So this narrative enrichment transfers to new situations. And so this is crucial for the child's developing way of understanding. So again, we tried to say, can we transpose this into a robot experience? And so what you're going to see here is a video where the ICUP has a goal of grasping this object. It's going to try to grasp it. It fails to grasp it. It looks in its repertoire. Do I have another action that can fulfill this goal? Yes. I can ask Gregoire to give me the object. I ask him to give it to me, and he gives it to me. So I've so here we'll see the... and so as this is happening, so when I see Angelo, we can talk about Giorgio Metta, our friend, and when we saw each other somewhere. Or when I see Maxime, we can talk about the good old days in the robot cognition laboratory. And if somehow I had forgotten these things, then the relationship that I have with these people would be catastrophic. And so losing memory makes you lose your personal relations with others. It's very devastating. So a robot that could act as a memory kind of helper could be what we're going to call a social bridge that allows you to maintain these relations with people in your entourage. So we can use this cognitive system to provide kind of a memory prosthetic for memory impaired people. So the system should be able to store memories in terms of interactions that you actually have with the robot. Like the Pepper, for example, can do Tai Chi, it can let you, it can do some kinds of coaching. It can also let you do social interaction via the internet and the tablet. You can use Skype or appear in. But then also, importantly, the human can narrate events to the robot. It can tell it, oh, today I played bridge with my friend. I had really great cards, but we lost anyway. And so then this narration of events is stored in the memory of the system. And then finally, in order to get the thing going, we realized that if you just take a robot and plunk it into somebody's house, there's no shared experience to begin with. So we have kind of an interview process where before we plunk it into their house, somebody tells the robot a little bit about the life of this person so that they already have some common experience. And now, once this is all done, the robot should allow the person to recall these memories in simple narratives so to form this social bridge. So if the person forgets, like if I see Angelo and for some reason I'm like, who is this guy? I know that I know him, but I can't remember where. The robot will help me, even being a diplomat, and so I won't even be embarrassed and say, oh, look, Peter, there's Angelo, remember? You know him from when you were in Plymouth and you guys were at this conference together and all kinds of things, and so everybody will be happy. So this is, so I'm going to show you a little interaction of a person with this robot. So she's never seen the robot before, had no training, no experience, and you'll notice the relative fluidity of the interaction.
On va commencer. Bonjour Madeleine. Peter Race, puis-je quelque chose sur votre passé? Rappelez-moi le nom de la ville où vous êtes né. À Rochefort. Oui, Rochefort est un endroit charmant. Rochefort, c'est là que vous avez dansé tout le week-end. Vous prenez le transporteur et allez à la place Colbert. Rappelez-vous que c'est là qu'ils ont fait les demoiselles de Rochefort. Nous amusons bien.
Parlons de bridge.
Je me souviens de certaines choses. Vous pouvez poser les questions suivantes.
Peter disait quoi?
Bien sûr, je me souviens. Peter m'a parlé du bridge.
C'était avec qui?
Le bridge était avec Huguette.
Et c'était où?
Le bridge était au club.
Au club. Et c'était arrivé quand?
Le bridge était arrivé bien.
Faisons du sport.
C'est bon de faire de l'exercice. Suivez ce que je fais, je vais vous montrer. Permettez-moi de vous montrer comment faire T-Aichi. Essaie de suivre mon mouvement avec tes bras.
Je passe le mouvement avec les bras.
Nous allons parler de Rochefort. Nous allons parler de bridge.
Ah, nous allons faire des bridge. Ensuite,
Nous avons fait de T-Aichi.
ensuite,
Au revoir.
au revoir.
Au revoir et merci, Madeleine. Je me souviendrai de toi pour toujours.
Oui. Merci, Piper.
Et donc, yeah, so you can see, I mean, she's totally infatuated with this robot. She's trying to hold hands with it. So there's this big smile on her face. So so that was kind of a proof of concept that this kind of thing is feasible. And so we did some sort of psychological testing using a standard battery of social acceptance tests with different questions before she interacted with the robot and after. And it's a little bit biased because before she had no idea what this robot was. So the acceptance score was very low. And the acceptance score after was near the threshold. This is another psychological study called Inclusion of Other in Self. And it asks you, how do you see you and the other person being your social proximity? And again, before, she had no idea, so it was very far, and after, she felt quite close to the robot. So again, this is very preliminary data, but it gives us the idea that we're going in the right direction. And so, actually, we've got plans underway right now. There's a stagiaire from the CPE working on this at this very moment at the INSERM lab, improving the memory system, allowing multiple different events of the same type to be discussed and having more fluid language interaction. And so I hope you kind of have an idea of this notion now, how narrative allows the structured organization of experience and how it adds on to just what we see visually, that narrative provides this additional information. And by the way, if you just realize narrative, why is this guy talking about narrative? Think about how much consumers we are of narrative. If you read novels, if you watch television series, if you watch movies, if you go to the theater, I mean, we are massive consumers of narrative. We live in narrative, and even you could say your own existence is a narrative. So narrative, very important. So a narrative companion can encode and recall experience. And this can help potentially memory-impaired people to continue engaged with people in their entourage, in their group. And so in the future, we're working on, we'll soon have some studies underway in Dijon with more extended population and improving the flexibility of the system. And so that's the end of the presentation.
I liked a lot the narrative element. It was new to me. I'm impressed. I'd like to know, for the actual experiment, do you have some kind of a dialogue system, the scripts, the links to the memory events recollected, or are you actually using your full reservoir system for the narrative?
So in in the stuff with the person here, we're using the choreographed Nauki native system that comes with Pepper, which actually, in particular, the language that's based on nuance, the language processing is quite sophisticated. So you can do. So we're not learning new grammatical constructions, and we have kind of a relatively simple language that the people can use. And in fact, in some cases, we'll even provide like a sort of a quick start, on the screen here in case you get lost. These are the kind of things you can say. So no reservoirs here, but the reservoirs are in the laboratory still. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, no, go.
Go ahead, wait. Yes.
Yeah, thanks for the nice presentation. Kuros Medali from Paris. I would like to ask you, I have a problem here with understanding the mechanism. In fact, the most of the basis is based on, neural network or let's say kind of artificial learning. But the problem is that here you have no interpretation mechanism. So, and I am asking myself while you can mix or probably generalize some of the aspect of what you call the experience, but how about the interpretation? Because without the interpretation and the relationship from the features of the object and the semantical notion, you would just move in the feature space and somehow often in a random way.
Yeah.
So that's why you have some funny means
Yeah, so that's an important question. Yeah, I think I understand your question. That's a very important question. The interpretation and the meaning. So again, if we go back to human development, children often hear things that they don't understand, and then we explain and answer questions. So in my example, when the child sees the person feeding the elephant, and the child doesn't yet know that animals are hungry, or doesn't know that straw is a kind of food that elephants can eat, the child doesn't understand that. So he can't interpret that action. But then the parent says he's giving straw to the elephant because that's food for elephants, and the elephant's hungry. So now the idea is, indeed, for robotic systems, interpretation is often missing. But through this notion of narrative enrichment, the human can provide to the robot additional links, like causal links and temporal links, identity links, spatial links, so that will enrich the interpretation. So the understanding may not be as deep as for humans, but at least it goes farther. So now, for example, the system can interpret an action in terms of causal relations that link a mental state to an action. So my answer to your question is, in order to provide increased interpretation of actions and to interpret in terms of meaning, we have this notion of narrative enrichment. So that's the... Yep.
Sorry, I have two questions about, when you generate the story itself, how much coherent it is over time? I mean, how much longer can you generate after you start to lose coherence, let's say?
So the story generation, there are different ways to generate the story. One, and this is, we have to admit also, when you do this kind of multidisciplinary research, you put your foot into an area and you discover this is a huge area. So narratology, understanding narrative structure, that's a huge area of research. In that research, there's the idea of kind of canonical narrative patterns. So that you identify the situation, you identify that there's some kind of a conflict, there's a resolution to the conflict, and then kind of a conclusion. So what we decided to do is say that, okay, we're going to have, in the context of these robot interactions, the robot will learn the canonical narrative format by observing how regular humans narrate these things, again, doing experiments with a couple hundred people on Mechanical Turk. So the answer to your question is the robot has sort of a template of what is a story, and then it kind of goes through that template and looks into the situation model. Is there something that corresponds to this next element in my template? And so in a way, yeah, and so that even can contribute to certain kind of anomalies that may happen if for example, if the situation model doesn't have all of the information required by the template.
So if I can ask some other questions, okay. Story is generated with narrative, or a narrative is generated. So how do you, maybe it's a bit related to the previous question, how do you evaluate the quality of what you generate?
Yeah, that's a good question. It was pure at the moment. It's purely subjective on our part. Like, does that make any sense? You know, and we know what the content is and what should be in the narrative. So at the moment, it's purely subjective. But you could imagine doing experiments with some kind of with having, like, people would have to do something based on what the robot tells them, and then you could measure performance. Or use so you could have humans involved in the evaluation, or some kind of more machine learning comprehension measure to measure the quality of the narratives. There was a question back, way back.
Just to follow up on the previous question, I noticed that the robot was using sentences like "Can you give me?" rather than "Give me." And similarly, it reacted to the question not so much a question by the human. Do you remember this? And this prompted the robot to start narrating its memories without being explicitly asked to. Is this the kind of thing that the robot learns from the conversations, or?
In that particular case, so that it could be learned by conversations, but in that case, I think we triggered automatically that when you say, "Do you remember something?" then for that demonstration, it was in the mode, okay, if I remember, I start telling the story. And that's the eternal developer question. You know, sometimes you say, okay, we could do that in a more ecological way, but for time constraints, we're gonna engineer it. And then you had a question?
Yeah. It was with Pepper. You measured like acceptance score using a narrative and remembering what Pepper did or what the person did before. Did you see any? Have you tried, or do you want to try something with where using the same robot with 2 person and what did you do with like you get before? The robot will tell. Well, we talked about anything. And did you see like have you tried it, or do you see that like more better acceptance because the robot is talking about other humans, or?
That's the kind of thing that we can do. I mean, what we're thinking about doing in the next step is to test the mnesic ability of the human with and without the robot. So for example, the human will. So one simple example would be the human will give a story to the person to read to the robot, and then later the person has to themselves answer questions about this story. And in one case, they have the robot that they can ask the robot to help them. In another, they don't, and we'll show that kind of trivially that having the robot helps. This thing that you're mentioning where, so it's more like having the robot refer to multiple people.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And that also brings in this idea of the social bridge. I actually have a little, yeah, so this notion that that there's a link, that the narrative companion kind of makes a bridge between the person and somebody in their entourage, and so we should try to measure that also.
Thank you so much. I understood the importance of narrative, and in the first part of your presentation, embodying the narrative is super important. I mean, breaking.
Yeah.
I don't clearly see the bridge in the second part of your presentation. I mean, the narrative here comes more like a memory, which could be embodied in a smartphone or anything else than a robot. Why choosing a robot? And where do you go with the robot?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first of all, for why choose a robot, the idea is that in the larger scope of things, indeed, such a memory assistant could be done in a Google Home or an Amazon Echo or something like this. The idea for having the robot participate is this whole notion that the robot is ergonomically in the space of humans, so it can do things with humans in human space. So it won't just be, whereas the Amazon Echo could be a memory assistant just for things that I tell you, the robot is going to participate in activities with the human and with other people, so it might actually be engaged physically, and then this whole notion of embodiment comes back into play, because what's happening is not just storing text, really, but actually things related to action that the robot is performing.
If I understand it right, you're using past narratives to create new future narratives involving with the robots.
Yeah, that can be. But your question was about embodiment, and so I'm saying the reason to have the physically present robot is that that shares the same kind of workspace, that could eventually manipulate objects together, so the human and the robot could do things physically, like doing this Tai Chi and stuff like that. So it's it's engaging the body of the robot in the interaction.
I have a question regarding when you pitch this narrative companions, do you think, narration is very important to create a sense of rapport, because you provide information for yourself, and or this can be viewed as small talk also. But I didn't see how, if you're measuring it, if you something, because it's very important in creating, especially the social bridge or social relationship.
Yeah, and even so, part of this So your question is, do we have mechanisms to help to build up the rapport?
Yeah.
Well, so in a sense, these measures are in the same ballpark. They're talking about acceptability of the robot. For the moment, the simple fact that the person is able to have an interaction with the robot, it's a foreign, it's kind of like if you go to China and you don't know, will I be able to interact with people? And so the simple fact that you can communicate and exchange some information and have some kind of real result, that's a positive, and so it's kind of a brute force rapport. It's not the kind of, so the answer is rapport is established by the interaction occurring at all. And then, but we can see that already this has a positive effect. It's also established by the cuteness of the pepper engineered by SoftBank and Aldebaran. So that robot all by itself is a rapport builder by the little movements that it makes and things like that.
At the same time, I think regarding the previous question of government, I think by playing on the behavior of the literature, that is a way up.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah.
Just last one.
Dernier.
La dernière.
Yes, the last question. Thank you.
in your slide where you explain that you have on the left the situation model and in the center you have the narrative model.
Yeah.
I wonder how much time does it take, how much time does it take to make a situation model as you have shown, and how much time did it take to create previously the narrative model?
So the narrative is generated kind of spontaneously by the human describing things, and then the situation model. So these are in situations that are kind of constructed by us to be very coherent. But so the situation model, every time the robot performs an action or recognizes the human performing an action, there is a whole protocol for action recognition that stores in an autobiographical memory, and also just kind of automatically goes and creates a node in this graph. And so initially these nodes are only linked by temporal links, and some causal things, like the robot knows that I failed, and then in my planning process, when I fail, I can search for an alternative. So that link is established automatically in the blooming narrative model, and then in the situation model, and then the tricky part is having the human say something like, "I gave you the toy because you wanted it," and that's kind of a pattern matching, looking for elements in the sentence that match with components in the situation model, and then constructing these links.
So let's thank Peter for this very